Good morning, welcome to Wednesday's Indycar. I'm Gordon Ross. On today's show, I'm just simply going to talk about one thing and one thing only. In the last 24 hours, I've put up a couple of polls asking people's opinions on whether they feel there's sufficient support to start the campaign for independence all over again, or whether they feel there aren't sufficient converts. There seems to be a great deal of doubt and uncertainty about whether we're ready, and doubt and uncertainty even about whether there is an appetite for another referendum. But what I was going to point out to you today is that this narrative of there not being enough support for another referendum is a false narrative. Those of you with longer memories will remember that prior to 2012, in other words, the time at which the first referendum was announced, there was only 26% of people in Scotland who supported independence. Now, at that point, you could have said there wasn't an appetite for a referendum, and yet, despite that, an SNP government majority was delivered, and the mandate that they held was for another referendum. This time, we know that support for independence is already at least 48%. Now, this is argued over as well. The British polls have us vacillating up and down between 45 and 50% and back down again and back up again, because their polls are designed to show that. Their polls exclude 16 and 17-year-olds for that exact same reason. And British pollsters always ask the same question of the same people, and those are the same people who don't change their minds, and this is why they ask them that question. My point today is that with nearly 50% of Scots apparently in favour of independence, it doesn't matter whether there's an appetite for a second referendum or not, there needs to be one. It's not like we have to have a referendum about having a referendum. That's not the issue. That's the British narrative. That's the Tories' point of view. They are trying to say to us that we would need to have enough support before we can call a referendum. Rubbish. We didn't have enough support the last time, apparently, to call a referendum, and yet we still elected a pro-independence government. And then we did it again. We elected a second pro-independence government, and we still have a pro-independence government that we elected. So there is always the appetite for another referendum. That has never gone away, and we must remember this and not listen to this drip feed of doubt and uncertainty that the British press are trying to create. Appetites for independence are hard to gauge. Even my own polling reveals uncertainty amongst people about whether or not there is sufficient support. I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever, personally, that I've converted 3 people that I know of personally who have changed from no to yes. There will be some who might have changed from yes to no, but I doubt that, sincerely doubt that there'll be many of those. There will be those who were no voters who have died off in their thousands since 2014. There will be new 16 and 17-year-olds who are coming in to voting age, who will be registering to vote, who may well be in favour of independence. I don't know. There might not be. But the point is, none of that has any influence on whether or not we should have a referendum. The democratic deficit, which is the entire reason for having an independence referendum, that is the lack of any democracy which represents Scotland or Scottish interests. It's that lack of democracy which drives the need for a referendum. It's that lack of justice, that lack of democracy in Scotland, which is the need for independence. That's what creates it. If Scotland had an equal number of MPs at Westminster to England, there would be no problem, because our voice would be listened to, and we would be at least equal to England in terms of democracy. But we're not. The fact of the matter is, this is not a union. We are dominated, occupied, and asset stripped by our near neighbour, and there's nothing that we can do about it, because the union was designed to make sure that we were always a minority in the English Parliament. So that democratic deficit is running at about 40%. We would need 40% more MPs at Westminster to be just equal to the British state. So we're not equal. It's not a nation of equals. And there has never ever been any reason not to examine independence again, because, let's face it, the British government has again decided to do something which the Scottish people have disagreed with in a majority, and yet we're being forced against our will to do so. We're being forced to leave the EU without any kind of plan. If we had been asked a question about leaving the European Union, and if there had been several different options on the table about how we would then trade with Europe afterwards, it would have been different. If we'd had equal representation and been able to decide alongside our English Union partners about what we did, it would have been a different story. But we know that's not true. We know that we are outnumbered 9-1 in the English Parliament. It's not a British Parliament, it's an English Parliament. 90%, more than 90% of the people who sit in that Parliament represent English constituencies. The rest of us are annoyances to them. It is not a British Parliament, it's an English Parliament, and we need to stop saying British. We're always terribly politically correct in Scotland about how we say things. But the fact of the matter is, Westminster isn't a British Parliament. It's an English Parliament that calls itself British in order to legitimise its takeover of the Scots nation and its running of the Scots nation against the wishes of the Scottish people. That democratic deficit has never gone away, and therefore the need for a referendum is always present. It's never disappeared. So when Ruth Davidson says there's no appetite for another referendum, what she means is there's no appetite amongst the Tories for another referendum. But everybody else, it's up for grabs. Nobody really minds. Remember, a referendum isn't Scotland deciding unilaterally to leave the UK. It's Scotland having a democratic vote. We have to convince the electorate that it's a good idea. And therefore, that's an entirely fair proposition. Why do the Tories fear it so much? If they are so confident that we're not going to leave the UK, that we're not going to pull out of the Union, why do they fear it so much? Why are they trying to stop it? They're accusing us of wrecking Brexit. We don't need to wreck Brexit. Brexit was wrecked the day they voted for it. It is a wrecking ball itself. Brexit is a piece of national scale industrial and social vandalism like we've never seen before. It is an entirely self-inflicted injury which has nothing to do with the Scots who voted unilaterally. Of all the countries, we voted in a majority against doing it this way. Now, I'm saying this way. If we had been asked if we wanted to leave the EU in favour of joining the European Free Trade Association, that might have been a different question. We might have got a majority for that, but we wouldn't get a majority for an uncontrolled, unplanned and completely chaotic Brexit with no idea of what the future holds. That way lies madness, that way lies chaos for industries, for people at a basic level who don't know whether they're going to be able to feed their families after Brexit, who don't know if they'll be able to afford their mortgages, who don't even know what the pound will be worth after Brexit. So there has never been any better time to have another look at independence, because I'm not saying that independence is about Brexit, but Brexit has forced us to come back to it. And we need to look at our independence not as an anti-Brexit alternative, although it is that. We need to look at our independence from the point of view of being able to control what we decide to do and not have it done for us by another country 400 miles away, which has nothing to do with us and has no interest in us whatsoever other than our natural resources. We all know this. The point I'm trying to make here today is that our independence is not contingent on Brexit, but Brexit has forced the issue to come back to us again much more quickly than it would normally have done. This once-in-a-lifetime nonsense that Ruth Davidson comes out with is baloney. When Alex Salmond said he thought it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, what he meant was, generally speaking, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for everybody in Scotland to have a go at voting on independence. It was a comment, an off-the-cuff remark. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a vow, it wasn't a written policy statement, and we all knew that, but the Tories have chosen to interpret it the way they like. Just as they chose to interpret the Brexit vote as a binding referendum, which it wasn't, incidentally. So when we do come to vote for independence, and we shall do so, we will do it, and we'll do so, I think, in the next 12 months at the very least. When we do that, we're not voting against Brexit. We're voting against having decisions like Brexit made for us. We need to decide what we do. We need to decide our relationship with Europe, not London, not the English government that outnumbers us, but our own parliament, which we fought very hard to have installed, to have our parliament reconvened. Bear in mind that the Scottish Parliament was never closed, it was never destroyed, it was never extinguished, it was merely suspended for 300 years. Like Sleeping Beauty, it was woken up by the people of Scotland, and it's back again. It exists, it has powers, and we're not going to let the English Parliament, run by the Tories, take those powers away. They were democratically voted for, they belong to us. This is a battle not about Brexit, it's a battle about who controls Scotland, who controls Scotland's resources, and who decides what people in Scotland should be doing. It should be us that decide that, not the people of England, not the people of Wales, not the people in Northern Ireland, but the people of Scotland. We, unlike other parts of the UK, we are a distinct nation. We're the oldest nation in Europe. We have a founding document. We alone in the UK have a written constitution, and our written constitution guarantees us certain inalienable rights, just like the American Constitution does in the US. And one of those rights is the right of Scottish people to decide their own future. We are sovereign. That means that we are above royalty, and we are above Westminster Parliament. We're even above our own Parliament. We decide what we want to have happen, and that's why we want to have a referendum. That's why we need a referendum, and that's why we don't need permission from anybody to have it. So those of you who might think there isn't an appetite for another referendum, you're mistaken. The Tories do not want another referendum. Everybody else in Scotland does. And everybody else in Scotland, incidentally, make up over 75% of the population who vote. The Tories, a mere quarter of the population. The vote in Holyrood the other day there to reject the English repeal bill in favour of the Scottish continuity bill, that vote was 3-1 against the Tories. If you look at the percentages, the Tories were the only people who opposed that bill, who opposed Scotland saying, no, we're not going to let you decide our future for us. The Tories are the only party in Scotland which doesn't like Scotland, and which doesn't want Scotland to be a country. They're the only party which doesn't recognise the place as a nation. Even the Labour Party, which, let's face it, have been absolutely lousy for years, decided to support the bill. Okay, it was in their own self-interest to do so, and it was probably expedient to keep a lid on things in Scotland for the time being. But the point is that the Tories were isolated. They're the only party in Scotland which doesn't want a referendum. Everybody else doesn't mind a referendum. We're quite happy to have it. The appetite is there. People want to have another chance to vote, to see if, as we were told the last time, to see if it was only 45%. I don't believe it ever was only 45%. There was a great deal of skullduggery went on during the last referendum. We'll never know the actual truth of it, because it will all be shrouded in secrecy for years to come. But if we control our own referendum this time, we have our own system, either an electronic system like blockchain, or if we're using the old-fashioned paper and pen system that we use pens, and that we have our counts in the polling stations, then we might be able to ensure that that style of referendum or that style of vote is in fact safe, and that we no longer have these mysterious votes turning up on the streets of Glasgow in polybags, and we no longer have mysteriously large numbers of votes turning up for people like David Mundell at the last minute, just when it looked as if he was about to lose his seat. All of these things would disappear if we controlled how the referendum is run. So I think talk of there not being an appetite for a referendum is just Tory nonsense. It's Tory propaganda. They're trying to convince you that people don't really want to go through a referendum again. Frankly, I'd rather go through another referendum than go through an uncontrolled Brexit, an unplanned Brexit. If we have to leave the EU, and maybe it's a good thing to leave the EU, who knows? Let's do it in a planned way that we control, where we take the decision on what kind of relationship we have after we leave. Because if you're going to leave the EU, Scotland needs to know, first of all, that it can maintain its levels of migration in and out of the country, that we can maintain our normal access to our trade with Europe without any extra fees, and our customs union remains intact so that we don't have to keep building border posts and checkpoints everywhere. If those things were done, we could continue trading outside the EU. We wouldn't need to be a member. It might in fact be cheaper for us to do that. But I can guarantee you one thing: an uncontrolled Brexit, as arranged by the Tories in their bumbling, chaotic, shambolic way, is not what we voted for. Scotland voted against that, voted 62% against that. What I'd like to see is that 62% of Scots who voted against that Brexit to vote for independence so that they can actually control what kind of relationship we have if we leave the EU. And I'm saying if we leave the EU because Scotland will need to decide that for itself. And that's what this is all about. It's about us deciding what we want, not England deciding what we get. And that's always been the problem. We are forced to take what we're given. We are a cap-in-hand slave nation to another state. And we are the only country in the world which is pathetic enough, weak enough, and stupid enough to allow another country to decide what we do. And that is essentially why I believe there should be another referendum and why I think there is an appetite for it. I'm off now. I'll see you later. Bye for now.